The Law's ongoing speaker program. I'm very pleased to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Penelope Andrews, who is the president and dean of the Albany Law School. Now, Penny is somebody that a lot of us know. She was here in the Salus Chair in 2005 at the college and became friends with us. A very energetic, active person, involved in legal education, involved in the struggle of many international struggles. Today's talk, Eliminating Barriers to Gender Equality, Conditional Interdependence as a Model. Formerly, Dr. Andrews was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at City University of New York School of Law. And prior to joining CUNY, Penny was a Professor of Law and Director of International Studies at Valparaiso Law School and a Professor of Law at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She was born and raised in South Africa and has extensive international experience, including teaching at law schools in Germany, Australia, Holland, Scotland, and South Africa, and of course Canada and the United States. And an annual award in her name, the Penelope E. Andrews Human Rights Award, was inaugurated in 2005 at the South African Law School of University of KwaZulu-Natal. Along with numerous other awards, she holds a Woman of South Africa Achievement Award, the Hayward Burns Shannara Gilbert Award, as well as Albany Law's Kate Stoneman Award, which she received in 2002. She has consulted for the United Nations Development Fund for Women and for the Ford Foundation in Johannesburg. She earned her BA and LLB from the University of Natal in Durban, South Africa, and her LLM from Columbia University School of Law. She has published extensively on topics centered on gender and racial equality, South African legal and constitutional issues, and the judiciary. Her recent book, From Cape Town to Kabul, Rethinking Strategies for Pursuing Women's Human Rights, was published in December 2012. I'd hold up a copy of the book, but in the front.
I've already put it in the
All
front.
right, here it is. So,
Thank you.
we decided not to set up a book table selling them today. So, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend, Penny Andrews.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Professor Slotkin, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming to hear me talk. I'm sorry that there's been a delay. Technical difficulties always seem to hinder me, and so I'm really sorry for the delay. Let me just say that I was here in 2005 as a Salus Chair. It was a wonderful year. I really got to know the community. I thought that the University of Saskatchewan is a terrific place. The students, the faculty, and it's been close to my heart ever since. So I'm really thrilled to be here. We don't have a bookstore because this book is so expensive. If you're a student, you'll have to get another loan to pay for the book, and the professors will have to get another job to pay for this book. I'm working to get it in paperback so that at least it's affordable. So the title of my book is Eliminating Barriers to Gender Equality, Conditional Interdependence as a Model. The sort of book came about because, as you know, I've been teaching law since 1986, starting in Australia. And for much of my career, I have written on issues on equality, particularly gender equality. And then I was very fortunate between 1990 and 1994, when South Africa was undergoing a sort of a transition from apartheid to democracy. I became involved with a group of women who were lobbying for the issue of gender equality in the Constitution. And as you know, South Africa probably has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. And certainly for women, the kinds of rights that the Constitution affords is highly admirable. But of course, South Africa also, to some extent, there's still a lag between the promises of the Constitution and gender equality. And since 1994, I've been with the election of President Nelson Mandela, I've been thinking very much about why this lag and why it's so hard to make the promises of a constitution real for women. And then I, continued to write, and I was sort of struck after 2001. I was living in New York City. As you know, 9/11 was a quintessential event in the United States. And early in 2002, the United States military and allies went into Afghanistan. What I found very interesting was the way that the invasion of Afghanistan was linked to the liberation of women. And so I began to think about what it would really take to look at transition in a society that in many ways started out, certainly within its recent history, of such repression and violence against women, and how you get from that to equality for women. But I also thought that as a model, the United States was not the best one, and I thought South Africa was an interesting model to look at the comparisons or the lessons that can be learned in this pursuit of gender equality. And then by then I was also, as we get in middle-aged and so on, very cynical about what can happen, because I've seen, I was a student when Zimbabwe was liberated, Mozambique, we all remember Nicaragua when everybody went down there, and women sort of become the center of the new national ethos, and often women's equality lags behind. So I started to look at this question about gender equality, and the book really was a series of little articles based on 4 questions that I raised. And the first question was about how a society seriously commences the project of gender equality after a brutal history of conflict. The second question was how the foundations are laid to best achieve the stated goal of equality. The third was the interplay of legal processes with other societal processes, such as education, in this project of gender equality. So in other words, how do you harness other institutions of the society in tandem with law? And then the fourth question, which I think for me it's the most difficult, not just for me, but I think all of us involved in advocacy. And that is, how does a society balance what is perceived as the secular nature of human rights enforcement within context of deeply entrenched religious mores or customary norms? So the issue really was about this question about pursuing women's rights in the face of enormous economic inequalities, social upheaval, and most importantly, cultural contestations. I had become very much aware of this question of cultural contestations living in Australia, because when I lived in South Africa, growing up in South Africa and being a human rights advocate there to end apartheid, we had assumed that the whole question of indigenous autonomy was a construct of the apartheid government, that homelands as self-government for South Africa's indigenous people was the way that the white South African state could essentially deny the majority of South Africans their rights to citizenship. But when I got to Australia, it was as the equation was turned upside down. I started writing about indigenous communities because I worked in some indigenous communities through a grant from the Labour government at the time. And I became aware, when I was focusing on women's rights, that the issue about cultural autonomy has a very different flavor in Australia. That for indigenous people, it really is a question of self-determination. And so I began to think about how one considers these questions in which the right to cultural autonomy and so on conflicts with national statehood and universal claims of rights. I won't have time, because I really would like to engage you in questions, to go through all the chapters in my book, but I'm going to give you a flavor of what it was. And before I do that, I just want to show you two pictures that I like to put in the PowerPoint. Let me see. How do I get?
Just hit the arrow that should take you.
Okay. Enter. All right. So that's the picture of South Africa, the first elections, and women and men, sort of black South Africans standing in line to vote. And one of the most profound facts that I read in the voting in South Africa, particularly amongst women who are over the age of 70 and so, for many of them it was the first time in their lives that they picked up pencils because they'd never had formal education. So it was the first time that they picked up a pencil to make a mark. And then this is a picture in Afghanistan of women voting in Afghanistan. And again, the same sorts of images that one saw in South Africa, except in South Africa people don't cover themselves in this way. Certainly women don't cover themselves in this way. Before I go to the book, I also wanted to just tell you why I chose South Africa and Afghanistan. One was obviously this question of transition and the idea that you could go to a country and seriously engage in a project of national reconstruction that takes into account gender equality. The second was that the international community has always been intensely interested in apartheid, in getting rid of apartheid South Africa, and the anti-apartheid movement was at one point the largest global human rights movement. And of course the interest in Afghanistan was the same. So the global concern, I think, is very, very important and very telling. The third is that both South Africa, in different ways, have had very violent histories of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa, in Afghanistan, a series of invasions, including the Soviet invasion and, of course, the rule of the Taliban. And then finally, the question of how you establish the rule of law. Countries like Canada and the United States, Australia, so the Western democracies as we know them, kind of the idea of the rule of law, even though we've seen breaches in the rule of law, it's kind of taken as a given. And in places, certainly in South Africa, where there was a different sort of equation, establishing the rule of law did mean something, and it was particularly pronounced in Afghanistan. So that is the reason why I decided to do this comparison. But it was not to see two countries. There were two sort of counterpoints. But I think in between there was a continuum around women's rights. So that is the book. I'd like to think that I made it a readable book. I tried to talk to an audience of non-academics as well. And when the book becomes affordable, I hope you'll think about either buying it or get your library to do so. And it's a conversation about this issue because so much has been written about gender equality. I would say that of the human rights advocates at the United Nations and certainly global, women have been incredibly energetic. There has been more, certainly the women's conferences of the UN, the way that women have organized in all fronts, in government, in the academy, in business. Sheryl Sandberg's new book, Lean In, has sort of been, it's really electrified the discussions in the United States. And so to some extent there was a lot. So what I decided to do is engage in this conversation. And that is basically the book. I look at this idea of conditional interdependence, which I will talk about a little bit. But I wanted to look at the global feminist project where women have come. I wanted to look at South Africa and what was possible, what the Constitution provided for, what the courts have done on equality. The judgments of the Constitutional Court have been particularly important. I wanted to see in Afghanistan the legal transition, how you begin to put in place a national consensus around gender equality in which people still have strong political loyalties to tribe, to region, and so on. So that was essentially, that's the total of the book. I had this series of questions, but I also really wanted to focus on this issue of citizenship and what citizenship means. And I say so because in the United States, looking at elections in the United States, there's so much around elections and winning elections and so on. And this idea of citizenship sometimes gets lost just around this idea that you vote for somebody every 4 years and so on. But what does it mean? What does citizenship really mean? what are the burdens both on the state as well as the citizen? And for women, I think that citizenship is not just about political representation and voting for those who represent you and so on, but it really is about three important factors in women's lives. And I would argue in everybody's lives, but because women still, there are places in the world where women are still fighting for the right to vote, I focus on women, of course. The first is equal access to economic resources, because we know that law, even the best law, doesn't make a difference in people's lives if they don't have the capacity to access those rights. The second is freedom from subordinating cultural practices. And the third, freedom from violence. So those interconnected factors really go to citizenship and the meaning of citizenship and the way that women can enjoy citizenship. So the South African Bill of Rights is sort of, as I said, so the South African model is a useful model, and I've just praised here what you find in the South African Bill of Rights: the right to equality, to dignity, civil and political rights, social and economic rights, the right to bodily and psychological integrity, personal security and freedom from violence. All of these are incorporated in this document. And then these other rights. Everyone has the right to participate in the cultural life of their choice, etc., etc. What is very interesting is that all these cultural rights have the caveat that they must not contradict the principle of equality. And so the South African model is sort of an interesting one because for the purposes of focusing on Afghanistan and societies like Afghanistan, in addition to the issues of economic inequality and freedom from violence, I really had to look at this question of culture with a capital C to see how a society embraces, as it attempts to introduce a sort of universal human rights ethos. And so the South African model was interesting. So what I try to do is really think about a methodology or a way of framing this question of the right to equality in a way that incorporates the many concerns of women. Because one of the consequences of this really energetic and huge amount of activity around women's rights and women's equality has led to many, many critiques, contradictions, and various ways that women approach this issue. So let me just give you an example. I don't know if it's true here, but in the United States, I find that I sometimes have conversations with young women and other, women of my age as well, talk about this. And one of the things that they will say is, well, I'm not a feminist, or the idea of feminists. Or somebody will say something like, and this has been the case certainly with critical race theorists and anti-colonial theorists or post-colonial theorists, that the idea is that feminism appears to be certainly an activity or a philosophy that benefits white Western women, or that it is anti-male and so on. So there's lots of, firstly, misconceptions and then contradictions and critiques of feminism and a women's agenda. But I also think the most fundamental question is that how feminism has become, or a certain strain of feminism has been seen as tied to American empire or America's agenda in the world. And so if you look at aid, if you look at interventions and so on, it's very hard to think about women's rights advocacy outside of the political moment in which we find ourselves. And so I wanted to sort of capture this idea. And then finally, what do we think about when we think about gender equality? So in the United States, for example, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. They've had many women who have been the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice and so on. Women are in positions of authority. Women are in the Congress. They're CEOs, CEO of Yahoo, and so on. So there are more women in law schools now. There are more women in medical schools. And it seems that sort of we're in the age, certainly in the United States, in which women have made great strides. And yet, if you turn on the television station or you pick up magazines in the United States, you'll think that there've been no advances. the discussion around family, the discussion around dress, the discussion around beauty and so on, it's almost as if we're back in the 1950s. So there's a real sort of, and then also women who come from communities that are more modest, let's say. Some of what they witness in the United States, particularly what is regarded as freedom, people have questions. It seems that certain conduct is seen as unseemly. So this question of equality and what's independence, I think, is highly contested, and I wanted to really capture that. So I thought about a way of a methodology that sort of aims to think about a process towards gender equality, and I've kind of coined it conditional interdependence only because I really wanted to capture this idea that most of the world, most people in the world live in societies in which there's a huge amount of interdependence. That independence is a wonderful choice, but it requires a certain level of economic choices, affluence, and so on. But most of the world, particularly the developing world, but I would argue in the developed world, in poorer communities and so on, there is a lot of interdependence, and people share strong communitarian values. In South Africa, we have a term, Ubuntu, which really is about this idea that our humanity is connected. But I didn't want to use interdependence as a subterfuge for shielding what happens within societies and within these communities, where even though people have these ideas about community involvement and community support, but we know that in these communities women are disadvantaged, children are disadvantaged in particular way, and they are their own sort of discrimination and disadvantage embedded within communities. And so I really wanted to think about this idea of interdependence, to think about how one might pursue this notion of conditional interdependence. So these were the reasons why I sort of looked at the idea of some kind of interdependence that takes account of communitarian values, but also recognizes discrimination embedded in communities. So these are the sort of features of conditional interdependence. The first is really that it's about a conceptual shift in the theorizing of women's rights and gender equality. So in other words, the starting point needs to be shifted somewhat. The second is focusing upon the interconnectedness of civil and political rights with economic, social, and cultural rights. Again, this idea that these rights, there's been a very, very strong movement in international law, and there's been very compelling evidence to show that rights are interconnected in a fundamental way, and that focusing only on one set of rights, namely classic civil and political rights, in effect diminishes the other important rights, social and economic rights. The third is that it reinforces the role of men in the project to pursue women's rights. There's now a whole range of literature around men's studies and masculinity studies and so on. And in some ways it seems very obvious. But if you look in many societies, particularly outside the more affluent societies of the global north, it is clear that the conscription of men is vital. In the same way that the conscription of white Americans in the South in the United States during Jim Crow and in South Africa during apartheid was important, so men who are powerful agents and who can make change possible is needed. You need to have the chiefs in villages in South Africa. You need to have powerful men in Johannesburg. You need to have powerful men in Kabul committed to the project of gender equality, and you have to do so in a purposive way. And finally, the idea that the community has a role to play in protecting women's rights. And in the book, I make a very strong argument for something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for women. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is a panacea for societies, but one of the things about the TRC in South Africa, as flawed as it was, it allowed South Africans to call what had happened something. It allowed the victims to tell the perpetrators the harm that they suffered. It allowed perpetrators, it forced perpetrators to confront their victims, and it gave a national record of what happened so that society can no longer deny its past. So I think in women, certainly in Afghanistan and places like that, and even in South Africa, we've argued, because the situation of women is still dire, that you need some kind of TRC-like model to pursue women's rights. This idea that that the whole community is responsible for gender equality and for women's rights. Now, Michael Kimmel, some of you may have heard of him, he's one of the leaders in the sort of masculinist movement, the male studies movement in the United States. He's quite a prolific scholar. I just wanted to sort of quote something that he said about, he's been very active in this idea, is that you need to make men central to the project of gender equality. He said, men have done very little to prepare for this completely different world. What has not changed are the ideas we have about what it means to be a man. The ideology of masculinity has remained relatively intact for the past 3 generations. That's where men are these days. Our lives have changed dramatically, but the notions we have about it, what it means to be a man, remains locked in a pattern set decades ago when the world looked very different. Now, this should not be seen as an attack on men. I have not, I think that there have been men who have certainly been very much part of the feminist agenda. Part of the problem about a masculinist view of the world is that everybody buys into it. And I think that that's part of the difficulty in the United States, for example, where there's been such great strides made towards gender equality. But in many places, there's still the tensions, even in the places where women now are becoming leaders. So I think that what I try to do is, with conditional interdependence, is take those the 4 features of conditional interdependence and really think about how you construct a strategy that takes into account the idea that you have to connect all rights, whether it's civil and political and so on. You have to look at inequality in a very, very comprehensive way. You have to ask some very difficult questions about the role of men and communities, and you have to ask some very, very basic questions. These are really very simplistic questions it's about the educational status of women compared to men. It's about whether girls are encouraged in schools to pursue careers in the same way that men are encouraged, whether women earn the same as men for the same kind of work. These are perennial questions, very simple, basic questions, but these are still the kinds of questions that many societies have answered in a way that really shows that women have a long way to go. If we look at how women are treated in the home, the nature and extent to which women are employed in jobs for which they are paid less than men, or which are regarded as too menial for men to hold, whether women are routinely subjected to violence, whether it's in the public or whether in their homes. South Africa is an incredible example of this, that South Africa probably has one of the highest rates of violence against women, rape and domestic violence, and yet South Africa has the most protective constitution for women. And it really is about cultures of masculinities and how you change, at a very fundamental way, attitudes towards women. So I'm not for a moment, the questions that I've raised in my book, all this discussion has been had over and over again by many people, feminist advocates, scholars have written about this. These are perennial questions, and they're perennial questions because they're ongoing questions. All the statistics still show that women overwhelmingly are poorer than men, that the economic resources that men can garner globally are far more than women. Women still suffer disproportionately from violence, that women are the major carers of children and so on. So we have a long way to go. I think that there are societies in which we can see, you can really see the project of gender equality and results. So the UN, India, the UN Development Report every year does a survey of the economic situation of women, of societies, of countries. And what what we can see from that is there's actually a correlation between affluence and women's status. So for example, every year, you know which country is the most affluent? Norway. And the Scandinavian countries tend to be up there. Norway is interesting. For some time ago, Norway passed, a few decades ago, Norway passed a law about quotas for women, representation in government. So at all levels of government, there's a quota for women participation. And in fact, Norway at some point had more females than males in government positions. But 2 years ago, Norway did something that I don't know how it would be accepted in Canada, but I know in the United States the Tea Party would go crazy. And that is that they passed a law that mandated that corporations, when they chose boards for corporations, that 50% had to be assigned to women. And this was because it was in the corporate sector that was the holdout in terms of the disparity between men and women. And so you see there's a correlation between affluence and women's equality. The poorest countries in the world, Yemen, Haiti, you look at the statistics and you look at the situation of women now. I don't know if it's causal, but it stands out. Where women are not full citizens, the societies do not benefit. And I think that's certainly for me, our whole idea about pursuing these questions are that they are perennial questions. And I know that you as students, probably when you get to my age, I hope that you will not be confronted with the same problems. But I think that they are clearly worth considering, and that is why I wrote the book. And I hope that conditional interdependence may be a good methodology to use to pursue that goal. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Penny. We have lots of time for a question period. The floor is open to you. Yes.
I'm just curious to know, why did you choose Kabul, Afghanistan? Why not Saudi Arabia?
Oh, because the United States was not going to invade Saudi Arabia to liberate women. It was just that moment that it was just because at that point I remember the very specific moment when I thought about it was the United Nations had, every year the United Nations declares March Women's Month, and they, International Women's Day in 2003 was dedicated to the women of Afghanistan. And the then First Lady Laura Bush gave a very powerful speech at the United Nations. So that's why I decided to focus on Afghanistan. But I think all the issues pertain to Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia, I think that women still do not have the right to vote. I think that, I've often looked at, in Saudi Arabia, when one looks at the discrimination against women, the legal discrimination, I think that there's some similarities to be drawn in the way that blacks were treated in South Africa. But the world chose to, confront apartheid. The world seems less reluctant to confront what's going on in Saudi Arabia or Yemen or, in many places. So yeah, that's why I chose Afghanistan.
Could you elaborate a little more about the correlation between gender equality and prosperity of a nation? Which one is more of a cause to the other?
Yeah, I don't know, but Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have done quite a lot of work on this, and Yunus Muhammad, when he started the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, have made these arguments, and you see that in societies in which women are full citizens, that there seems to be the correlation. I don't know what comes first, but if you just take it as a sort of most obvious thing, that if you have all your citizens engaged in productive economic and social activity, then it's obvious that the society will benefit. So, but what comes first? That obviously the society has to make the conditions possible for women to flourish, for all citizens to flourish. But yeah, so I don't know which comes first, but that's just the correlation that you see, that the poorest countries in the world tend to have the most restrictive laws and policies regarding women. Yes?
You mentioned your choice of Afghanistan with the US going in there.
and certainly I remember at the time there was a lot of talk about the situation of women in Afghanistan. But I'm wondering whether you think that was a genuine motivation for going in, and secondly, whether or not there has been genuine, significant improvement for women as a result.
Well, you know, whether the decision to go in was genuine, I don't know. But from this distance, there was not a lot of energy put into sustaining that momentum, because I don't know if you remember, about 3 years ago, President Karzai signed a law that would have essentially allowed marital rape, and you see the violence that has been perpetrated against women who were brave enough to get involved in the political process, women who stood for parliament and so on. So I don't know whether it's just an inability to deal with such entrenched attitudes, or whether the United States and its allies were not as committed. I don't know. It's hard to tell. You know, it's the research out of Afghanistan. If you take firstly the popular press and so on, it's very much gloom and doom, and everything's destined to fail. But when you go deeper and you talk to you know, people who spend a lot of time in the two places and so on, and even the UN, I don't think it's as dismal as what it's perceived. I think that there have been great strides made. More women are going to school now, girls are going to school than ever. And I think that once you plant a seed of possibilities, you can't go back to. So even if you've not gone as far as, you know, the invasion didn't do what it intended to, there were many, many reasons for that. And I don't know if the society will collapse, but I don't, you know, it's really unclear. But I don't think that it's as dismal as what it was. You know, I think that, again, this idea, for me, it's always difficult. This picture on the book is not in Afghanistan, it's in Cape Town, South Africa. One of the things that's happened in Cape Town, where the majority, I don't know how many of you have been to Cape Town,